small mining town in the interior of Nevada at that time. It was one of those short maintenance jobs on equipment used in old mines that were still operating in the region. The town was small, practically a cluster of trailers, a few bars, and a gas station that stayed open almost 24 hours for truck drivers and night shift workers. That particular night I had finished my shift much later than usual. It was already past 11 when I finally left the warehouse where we had been working. The air was cold and dry, the way it usually gets in the Nevada desert when night falls. I got into my car in the dirt parking lot behind the building and started the engine to begin the drive back to the town where I was staying. The road there was a long rural highway that crossed almost completely deserted areas. The first part of the trip was completely normal. The road was practically straight for miles, surrounded by dry terrain and some low rock formations that only appeared when the headlights reached farther ahead. There were no light poles along that stretch of highway, so everything I could see was the asphalt illuminated by my own headlights and the reflection of small roadside markers indicating curves. For nearly 40 minutes I didn't see another vehicle, not coming in the opposite direction and not behind me. The car radio was on very low, playing a local station that barely had signal in that area. The only constant sound was the engine and the wind passing along the body of the car as I moved along the empty road. After almost an hour of driving on that completely empty highway, something finally appeared in the rearview mirror. At first it was just a small point of light very far behind me. It looked like a car that had just entered the road somewhere farther back. That didn't catch my attention at first because it was normal for another vehicle to eventually appear on the highway. I kept driving at the same speed, holding the car steady in the lane while the road continued straight between dark hills on both sides. A few minutes passed and that point of light became brighter. Soon it turned into two clearly defined headlights in the mirror. They were still far away, but now it was clear that the car was on the same highway, coming in the same direction as me. What started to draw my attention was the way those headlights behaved. The car didn't seem to be trying to pass. It also wasn't falling behind. The distance between us seemed to remain exactly the same for several minutes. I looked in the mirror from time to time and the headlights were still there, always in the same position, as if they were matching my car's speed precisely. I thought maybe it was just someone driving on autopilot, maintaining a comfortable distance. Even so, after a few minutes, I started observing more carefully. The road ahead remained completely empty, and the only thing behind me was that pair of headlights that seemed to have appeared out of nowhere. After watching it in the mirror for a few minutes, I decided to run a small test to see if it was just coincidence. I pressed the accelerator a little more and increased my speed. Nothing extreme, just a few miles per hour faster than I had been driving before. The highway ahead was still completely empty, so there was no risk in speeding up slightly. For the first few seconds, the headlights seemed to fall a little farther back in the mirror, but soon I noticed they were approaching again. In less than a minute, they were back at exactly the same distance as before, neither closer nor farther. That made me frown as I looked again into the rearview mirror. Then I did the opposite. I lifted my foot off the accelerator and let the car slow down gradually. The engine began making less noise as the car decelerated. I waited a few seconds to see what would happen with the vehicle behind me. The headlights also began to slow down. It didn't take long before they returned to the exact same position in the mirror, the exact same distance. That started to make me uneasy. It wasn't impossible that it was just someone driving very carefully, but the precision with which the car maintained that distance seemed too strange to be coincidence. After that, I stopped doing obvious tests and tried to simply keep driving normally for a few minutes. Even so, I couldn't avoid constantly checking the rearview mirror. The pair of headlights remained there, fixed in the same position as if attached to a precise distance behind my car. The road ahead stayed completely empty, and the only lights that appeared were reflectors on road signs and markings on the asphalt that glowed when the headlights passed over them. The silence inside the car also began to feel heavier. The radio had lost the station signal, and now only made that low static noise typical of being far from any city. I began thinking of simple explanations. Maybe it was someone who simply didn't feel the need to pass. Maybe it was a truck or a heavier car trying to keep a safe distance. Even so, the feeling that the car was reacting exactly to my changes in speed wouldn't leave my mind. At one point, I looked toward the side of the road, trying to find some exit or secondary road I could take if I needed to stop for some reason. That was when I saw a small dirt entrance a few miles ahead, marked by a very subtle reflective sign on the shoulder. As I approached that small dirt road, I started thinking it might be a good opportunity to find out whether that car was really following me, or if everything was just coincidence. The dirt road seemed to lead to some isolated area away from the main highway. There was no large sign indicating a town or a farm, only a small reflective sign with a rural road number. I slowed down a little before the entrance and used my signal as if I actually intended to turn. I looked again into the rearview mirror to see how the car behind me would react. The headlights remained at exactly the same distance, showing no urgency to pass. At the last second, I turned the wheel and left the highway, entering the dirt road. The car raised a small cloud of dust behind me as the tires left the asphalt. The road was narrow and completely dark, surrounded by dry terrain and scattered rocks. I immediately looked in the rearview mirror, expecting to see the headlights making the same turn behind me. But there was nothing. The headlights had simply disappeared. The road behind me was completely dark again, as if no car had been there seconds before. That gave me a strange feeling. I was certain the car had been right behind me moments before I left the highway. I kept driving along that dirt road for a few minutes, more to try to understand what had just happened than for any other reason. The car bounced slightly as it passed over small irregularities in the terrain. Dust rose behind me and briefly appeared in the beam of the headlights before disappearing into the darkness. I checked the rearview mirror several times, expecting to see some sign of that car reappearing. But there was nothing. The road behind me was completely empty. That didn't make much sense. If the car had simply been traveling along the highway, it should have passed by while I was turning. But I hadn't seen any headlights crossing the road when I made the turn. After a few minutes driving along that secondary road, I began noticing that it seemed to lead to some kind of intersection farther ahead. I could see a small opening on the horizon where the road appeared to meet another path. The terrain there was completely open, with small rises of dirt and low shrubs scattered across the desert. As I approached the intersection, I slowed down a bit to observe better. That was when I saw something that made my stomach tighten immediately. On the right side of the intersection, there was a car parked on the shoulder. The headlights were off, but I immediately recognized the shape of the vehicle when my own headlights partially illuminated its side. It was the same car that had been behind me on the highway. It was simply parked there, as if it had already been waiting at that point before I arrived. The car wasn't running, and there was no visible movement inside. Even so, at that moment, I had the very clear feeling that someone was sitting inside watching the road. I slowed down even more when I noticed the car parked on the shoulder. My first thought was that it might be coincidence, that it could simply be another vehicle parked at that rural intersection. But as I got a few yards closer, it became impossible to ignore the fact that the shape of the car was exactly the same one I'd seen in the rearview mirror for almost an hour on the highway. The vehicle was parked slightly off the road, with its wheels turned toward the shoulder. There were no lights on inside. The interior looked completely dark. Even so, the presence of that car there in such an isolated place gave me an immediate sense of alertness. I slowed down even more as my car approached the intersection. The dirt road met another equally narrow road that continued toward the hills. The parked car was positioned exactly on the side of that meeting point. For a second, I thought about stopping and asking if the person needed help. But something about the situation made me abandon that idea immediately. I couldn't see any clear silhouette in the driver's seat, but I constantly had the impression that someone was inside the vehicle. The silence around the area felt too heavy. There was no wind at that moment and no sound of other cars passing along the distant highway. As my car approached the intersection, my headlights fully illuminated the parked vehicle for a few seconds. It was enough to confirm what I had already suspected. It really was the same car that had been behind me on the highway. I recognized a small sticker on the rear window that I had noticed earlier when looking in the mirror. That sent a cold chill up the back of my neck. I had no idea how that car could have arrived there before me, since I had turned onto that dirt road suddenly. I didn't stop the car. I continued driving straight through the intersection without looking much to the side. As I passed the parked vehicle, I had the feeling that someone was watching my car go by. I didn't see any clear movement, no door opening, nothing that confirmed it. Even so, that feeling wouldn't leave my mind. After crossing the intersection, I accelerated slightly and continued driving along the dirt road until I reached the main highway again a few miles ahead. For the rest of the trip to the town, I checked the rearview mirror several times, expecting to see those same headlights appear behind me again. They never did. Story 2. I was returning from a long trip that night. I had spent the weekend visiting my sister in Erie in northern Pennsylvania, and I needed to get back home before the next morning because I had to work early. The drive to my city normally took about 4 hours depending on traffic. I left her house late, close to 10 at night, expecting the highway to be practically empty during the early hours of the morning. Anyone who drives a lot in that part of the state knows that there are several old, deactivated toll plazas scattered along the road. Some were abandoned when the highway was modernized, but the structures are still there, kind of forgotten, with empty booths and old rusted signs. During the day, you barely notice them, but at night, when everything is dark and the road is empty, those structures seem much stranger. The first part of the trip was completely normal. The highway was almost empty, with only a few trucks passing from time to time. The sky was overcast, so there wasn't much moonlight. My car's headlights illuminated only a few yards of asphalt ahead, and the rest of the landscape remained dark on both sides of the road. I had the radio playing very quietly, more to break the silence of the drive than to actually listen to music. After nearly 2 hours of driving without stopping, I began to feel a little tired. I stayed focused on the road, trying to keep my attention as I crossed those long and silent stretches of highway. After some time driving in that constant silence of the road, I approached one of the old abandoned toll plazas. Anyone who has passed through those structures knows what they look like. Even abandoned, the booths still line up over the road as if they were still operating, but with all the lights turned off and old signs indicating lanes that no longer exist. Normally, cars just pass along the sides where the asphalt was open to go around the old booths. As my car approached that structure, I slowed down a little, more out of habit than necessity. My headlights illuminated the concrete columns and the small glass booths with dirty windows hanging over the road. That was when something caught my attention in the corner of my vision. Inside one of the booths, I had the quick impression of seeing someone standing there. At first, I thought it was just a shadow created by the light of my own headlights passing through the booth's glass. But when I got a few yards closer, I had a clearer glimpse for a second. It really looked like a man standing inside the toll booth looking toward the road. He wasn't moving, just standing there as if watching the cars that passed. That lasted only an instant, because my car was already passing the structure, and my headlights were illuminating other parts of the road again. As soon as I passed completely through the old toll plaza, I quickly looked in the rearview mirror trying to see the booth where I thought I had seen someone. But the structure was already fading behind me into the darkness of the highway. My car's taillights illuminated only a small patch of asphalt behind me, and then everything returned to complete darkness. I started thinking it had probably just been a shadow created by the reflection of my headlights. That highway had several of those abandoned structures, and when you pass them during the early hours of the morning, the play of light and shadow can easily fool your eyes for a second. I took a deep breath and tried not to think much about it. I kept driving for several more miles without seeing another car nearby. The road continued straight between areas of low forest and hills that appeared only as dark silhouettes against the sky. The radio was still playing quietly inside the car, but I barely paid attention to the music. At one point, I started noticing red lights appearing far ahead. At first, they looked like the taillights of a few cars. As I got closer, I realized there was a small line of vehicles stopped on the highway. I immediately slowed down. Some reflective cones were positioned on the road, indicating some kind of temporary roadblock or roadwork. I gradually reduced speed until I stopped behind the last car in the line. There were maybe 6 or 7 vehicles in front of me, some trucks farther ahead and some passenger cars scattered between them. All of them were completely stopped on the road. The brake lights formed a red line in the middle of the highway's darkness. I looked around trying to understand what was happening. I couldn't see any maintenance truck immediately ahead or any construction lights near where I had stopped. Maybe the blockage was a few yards farther ahead, outside the range of my headlights. My car engine remained running while I waited. The environment became extremely quiet at that moment. When you stop in the middle of a highway during the early hours of the morning, with no traffic passing and no city noise nearby, the silence feels much heavier than normal. I looked at the rearview mirror out of habit, expecting to see other cars approaching and joining the line behind me. That was when something in the reflection caught my attention. At first, I thought it was just someone stepping out of one of the cars farther back. But as I focused better on the mirror, I realized there was a man walking slowly along the highway between the stopped vehicles. At first, I didn't think anything particularly strange about it. Some people really do get out of their cars when they are stuck in long roadblocks, especially if they think the wait might take a while. But something about the way that man walked caught my attention. He didn't seem to be heading toward the front of the line to see what was happening. He was walking slowly between the cars, moving from vehicle to vehicle, as if he were observing each one. The red light from the brake lamps reflected on the wet asphalt and partially illuminated his body as he walked. That was when I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. His clothing looked exactly the same as what I had seen in that toll booth a few miles earlier. The same silhouette, the same kind of dark coat. I felt a chill run up the back of my neck the moment that thought crossed my mind. I kept watching in the mirror as he slowly approached the line of cars where I was stopped. He didn't seem to be in a hurry. He just walked calmly between the stopped vehicles, leaning slightly to look inside each car as he passed. As I continued watching through the rearview mirror, the man moved closer and closer to where my car was stopped. He walked through the narrow space between the vehicles, passing very close to the car doors. Sometimes he tilted his head slightly as if trying to see better inside the cars. The lighting on that stretch of highway came only from brake lights and a few reflectors from the cones scattered on the road. That made his face appear only for seconds when he passed through a stronger beam of light. Even so, the way he moved seemed strangely calm for someone walking in the middle of a highway during a nighttime roadblock. I felt a strange tension while watching that scene in the mirror. None of the other drivers seemed to react much to his presence. At least not visibly. Some cars had people inside looking forward, waiting for the line to move. Others were completely dark. The man kept walking between the vehicles, looking inside each one for a few seconds before moving on to the next. It almost looked like a pattern. He would approach the window, look inside, then continue slowly down the line. When he finally reached my car, I looked away from the mirror for a moment, pretending to adjust something on the dashboard. I don't know exactly why I did that. Maybe it was just a reflex because I didn't want him to realize I was watching him. A few seconds later, I looked again in the rearview mirror, expecting to see him farther ahead in the line, but he wasn't there anymore. I looked to the sides, then ahead down the road. There was no sign of him walking between the cars in front of me. Shortly after that, the line finally started moving again. The cars began to move slowly while the cones were removed from the road a few yards ahead. I continued driving along the highway, trying to focus only on the road in front of me. Even so, for several miles after that roadblock, I kept occasionally checking the mirrors of my car. I never saw that man again, but to this day I clearly remember the strange feeling of recognizing the same silhouette I had seen standing inside that abandoned toll booth. Story 3. I was driving back home after visiting some friends in Wichita. At the time, I was studying at a smaller university in another city in the state, and I had gone to spend Saturday with them because it had been a long time since we had seen each other. We ended up staying up late talking and watching games, and before I realized it, it was almost 2 a.m. I had class the next day, so I decided to hit the road anyway instead of sleeping there. The drive to my city took a little over an hour along a state highway that crossed a large rural area of Kansas. Anyone who has driven on those roads knows that during the early hours of the morning, traffic practically disappears. There are long stretches where you can drive several miles without seeing another car. When I left the city, there were still some lights on the streets, but just a few minutes later, I was already completely outside the urban area. The highway stretched long and straight between dark fields on both sides. It was early spring, so the wind blew strongly through the open areas and sometimes made the car sway slightly when it passed through more exposed parts of the road. The radio was playing very quietly on the dashboard just to break the silence inside the car. The road was so empty that I could see several miles ahead, illuminated only by my own headlights. From time to time, a distant truck appeared coming in the opposite direction. But aside from that, it felt like I was the only car on that highway. After driving for nearly 40 minutes along that almost empty highway, I started to feel that typical late-night fatigue. It wasn't anything extreme, just the kind of light drowsiness that makes you pay closer attention to the road to stay focused. I turned the radio up a little and lowered the window slightly to let some cold air in. The early morning wind entered the car, carrying the dry smell of the fields surrounding the road. A few minutes after that, I saw something appearing on the side of the highway ahead. At first, it looked like just a blinking point of light on the shoulder. As I got closer, I realized it was a car stopped with its hazard lights on. The orange lights blinked repeatedly in the darkness, illuminating part of the shoulder and the grass beside the road. A man was standing near the driver's door, waving his arm when he saw my car approaching. That immediately made me slow down a little. It wasn't unusual to see someone stopped on the highway because of a flat tire or some mechanical problem. especially on rural roads like that one. Even so, I stayed alert as I approached, trying to observe the situation better before stopping completely. As I got closer to the parked car, I started to see the scene more clearly in the light of my headlights. The vehicle was pulled over on the shoulder, facing the same direction as the highway. The hazard lights blinked steadily, reflecting off the dark asphalt and the car's metal body. The man beside the vehicle kept waving his arm, that typical gesture asking for help from someone passing by. He seemed to be trying to get my attention before I drove past. I lifted my foot off the accelerator and began slowing down even more. On rural roads, many people really do stop to help when someone appears to be having car trouble. That was when I noticed something that immediately made me more alert. The trunk of the car was open. At first I thought maybe he was looking for a tool or trying to get the spare tire to change a flat. That still seemed completely plausible. But as my car got closer and the headlights illuminated the back of the vehicle more clearly, I noticed something that made no sense at all. Inside the trunk there was another person. A man was sitting inside it, facing toward the road. He didn't seem to be trapped or trying to get out. He was simply sitting inside the open trunk, looking directly at the passing cars. At that moment I felt an immediate warning in my stomach. Something about that scene just didn't seem right. The man inside the trunk wasn't moving in a desperate way, wasn't asking for help, and didn't look trapped. He was just sitting there, with his arms resting on the sides of the compartment, watching the road as if he were waiting for something to happen. The blinking light from the car illuminated his face for fractions of a second, and every time the light flashed I could see that he was looking directly toward my lane. The man outside the car kept signaling for me to stop. But now that I had seen the other man in the trunk, the whole situation felt completely wrong. My mind started trying to find some logical explanation for it, but none of them made much sense. It didn't look like someone trying to help a friend stuck in a car. It didn't look like an emergency. It looked more like they were waiting for a car to slow down at that point on the highway. That was when I decided I wasn't going to stop. I pressed the accelerator again before even reaching the parked car. Instead of pulling over onto the shoulder like I had thought about doing just seconds earlier, I kept my car in the lane and began picking up speed again. As I passed the vehicle, my headlights illuminated the whole scene for a moment. The man outside the car was still making the gesture asking for help, but I noticed that he stopped waving at the exact moment my car began accelerating instead of stopping. At the same instant, I saw something that confirmed even more that something was wrong. The man sitting inside the trunk moved quickly. He didn't look surprised or confused. He simply looked like he was reacting to the fact that I hadn't stopped. I was already several yards ahead when I quickly looked in the rearview mirror. The car with the hazard lights was still stopped on the shoulder for a second, but then the man who had been outside ran to the back of the vehicle. As I kept accelerating along the highway, I could still see in the mirror what happened next. The man outside the car pushed the trunk down forcefully. The lid slammed shut. The hazard lights were still blinking as he ran to the driver's door. It all happened much faster than I expected. It was as if the two of them already knew exactly what to do the moment a car didn't stop. I kept watching in the rearview mirror as my car gained distance. For a few seconds, the vehicle remained stopped on the shoulder. Then the hazard lights suddenly turned off. Right after that, I saw the front headlights turn on. The car pulled off the shoulder and entered the highway behind me. At that moment, my heart started beating faster because now I was certain that this wasn't just a strange roadside situation. I pressed the accelerator harder, trying to put as much distance as possible between us. The highway remained practically empty with no other cars around. The wind hit the sides of my car strongly as I drove faster than before. In the rearview mirror, I could see the headlights of the other car becoming brighter on the road behind me. It had fully entered the highway and was now in the same lane as me. I kept driving like that for several minutes, constantly checking the rearview mirror while the car behind me maintained a considerable distance but didn't disappear. After some time, I finally began seeing the distant lights of the small town that came before my university. When I entered the illuminated area of the town, I turned onto the first busy street I found. When I looked again in the rearview mirror, the headlights that had been following me were no longer there. To this day, I still think about that scene on the side of the highway. I don't know exactly what those two men were expecting to happen that night, but I'm almost certain that if I had stopped my car to help, that trip would have ended in a very different way. Story 4. I was driving alone through the interior of Colorado on a winter night when this happened. At the time, I was working temporarily organizing inventory and documentation for a small company that served more remote towns near the region of Pueblo, so sometimes I had to travel between towns at inconvenient hours because work ended late, and I always thought it was better to return home the same day. That night had been especially long. I left work after 11, tired with my shoulders stiff from sitting all day and then carrying light archive boxes back and forth. The temperature had dropped very quickly after dark, as it usually does in Colorado during winter, and when I got into the car, the windows were already starting to form a thin layer of ice along the edges. I turned on the heater, waited for the windshield to clear, and set the GPS because even though I knew much of the interstate, there were still stretches and exits that I preferred to follow with navigation just to be safe, especially at night. The main road was relatively empty. I saw an occasional truck far away, a few cars spaced too far apart to feel like real traffic, and that repetitive pattern of reflective signs appearing suddenly in the headlights and disappearing moments later. The sky was completely clear with no snow falling, but the cold was that dry kind that feels like it seeps into the car through invisible gaps even with everything closed. I remember driving with both hands on the wheel, the radio off, listening only to the sound of the heater and the tires on the icy asphalt, trying to stay alert because I could already feel that early morning fatigue slowly setting in. The problem started when the GPS directed me to take an exit that in theory should have kept me on the correct route to reconnect with the main interstate after a small detour caused by a construction area. I saw the overhead sign above the lane, saw the arrow in the app, and followed the direction without thinking too much about it. But as soon as I took the exit, I immediately felt that something seemed wrong. Instead of reconnecting to a wide highway interchange, the road began narrowing far too quickly. The interstate lights faded behind me, and I entered a much smaller secondary road with almost no shoulder and hardly any lighting. It wasn't a dirt road, but it also didn't feel like a route meant for much traffic. There were stretches of darker asphalt, a few small crooked signs on the side of the road, low fences disappearing into the darkness, and open fields on both sides covered in that dull winter tone, as if everything were frozen even without visible snow on the pavement. I glanced at the GPS map on the mount, and the blue line still said I was on the route, which only made me more frustrated because it clearly didn't feel right. I slowed down slightly to observe my surroundings better and try to find somewhere to turn around, but the road continued forward, with almost no visible options. The silence on that road was very different from the silence of the interstate. There was no distant sound of cars passing in other lanes, no scattered lights on the horizon. It was just my car, the headlights carving a short tunnel into the darkness and the faint white reflection of my breath occasionally appearing when I exhaled closer to the window. That was when I began thinking that maybe I should keep going for a few more minutes until I found a safe place to turn around, because stopping in the middle of the night there seemed worse than continuing forward. After a few minutes driving along that narrow road, I began searching for a place where I could simply turn the car around. But the farther I went, the clearer it became that the road hadn't been designed with easy turnarounds in mind. There were fences on both sides, farm entrances closed with metal gates, and stretches where the road felt like a long corridor between dark fields. The GPS still showed that I was en route, but the blue line made a strange arc before reconnecting with the interstate farther ahead. I was alternating my attention between the map and the road when something appeared in the rearview mirror. At first it was only a distant glow too small to identify, but it didn't take long for that point of light to turn into two clearly defined headlights behind me. The first thing I thought was that it was probably just another vehicle that had entered the same road after I had. By itself, that wouldn't have been strange, even at that hour of the night. What started to bother me was how quickly the headlights grew in the mirror. Within seconds, they were much closer than I expected. As they approached, I realized from the height and the shape of the light that it was a large truck. The cab looked tall and the headlights sat higher than those of a normal car. Naturally, I maintained my speed, expecting the truck to either slow down slightly or keep a safe distance behind me. But that didn't happen. The truck kept closing the distance until it was practically pressed against my rear bumper. I could see the front grille clearly illuminated in the mirror. I gripped the steering wheel tighter when I realized how close the truck was. The road was already too narrow for such a large vehicle, and seeing a truck that size practically glued to the back of my car immediately made me tense. I slowed down a little, imagining that maybe the driver wanted to pass. Sometimes truck drivers get impatient when they encounter a smaller car on a secondary road, But even when I reduced my speed slightly, he didn't try to overtake me. Instead, he kept exactly the same distance. It was as if he were deliberately tailgating my car. I glanced again at the GPS, trying to orient myself better. The blue line still indicated that the road should eventually reconnect with the main interstate. Even so, the route seemed far too long for such a simple detour. The road stretched ahead with no wide curves, no lighting, and no houses visible anywhere nearby. Just dark fields and fences disappearing into the night. In the rearview mirror, the truck's headlights remained so close that they sometimes seemed to fill almost the entire mirror. I could even see the shadow of my own car projected onto the road ahead because of the intensity of the light behind me. I continued driving along that road for several minutes, trying to stay calm and focus only on the path ahead. The truck never increased the distance, but it also didn't attempt to pass. It simply remained stuck behind me, matching every small change in my speed. I tried accelerating slightly to see if I could create some space between us. My car's engine responded well and my speed increased a few miles per hour. For a few seconds, the headlights seemed to fall slightly farther back in the mirror, but it didn't take even half a minute before the truck accelerated as well and returned to exactly the same distance as before. That was when I started getting genuinely nervous. It no longer felt like coincidence or just an impatient truck driver. It felt deliberate. I looked again at the GPS map, hoping to see an intersection or a return point appearing ahead. Finally, the blue line showed that the road should reconnect with the interstate a few miles farther on. That gave me a small sense of relief because it meant I wouldn't be trapped on that isolated road much longer. Still, as I continued driving, the feeling of having that enormous truck practically pushing my car down the road wouldn't leave my mind. The road began curving gently around small rises in the terrain, forcing me to slow down again. Even on those curves, the truck stayed exactly behind me, matching every movement as if it were tied to my car. I could see the reflection of its headlights illuminating the interior of my vehicle and casting shadows across the dashboard. It made it impossible to ignore its presence. Every time I checked the mirror, the headlights seemed larger and closer. I started feeling that kind of tension that makes you focus on every detail of the road. After several more minutes, I finally saw something that gave me hope. Ahead of the road, there was a small access lane that appeared to reconnect with the main interstate. It wasn't a large exit with illuminated signs, but a wider paved connection that rose toward an overpass in the distance. I immediately began slowing down slightly, preparing to turn and finally return to a larger road where there would be more traffic and lighting. That was when the truck's behavior changed for the first time since it had appeared behind me. When I began reducing speed to enter that connection leading back to the interstate, the truck finally did something different. For the first time since it had appeared behind me, it accelerated. The sound of the heavy engine grew louder behind my car, and the headlights shifted slightly to the side of the road as if the driver were preparing to pass. That caught me by surprise because for several miles the truck had simply remained glued to my rear bumper, without showing any intention of overtaking. Within seconds, it moved to the left side of the narrow road and passed my car. The truck went by very close, creating a rush of wind that made my vehicle sway slightly. As it moved ahead of me, I briefly saw the long side of the trailer illuminated by my own headlights. The truck accelerated several yards ahead, and for a moment I thought it would finally disappear down the road and continue on its way. But then something happened that made my stomach tighten immediately. The truck slowed down abruptly. Instead of continuing along the road, it turned the wheel and stopped sideways in the middle of the lane, completely blocking the road ahead. Its red taillights lit up while the trailer occupied nearly the entire width of the road. I slammed on the brakes to avoid hitting it. My car stopped a few yards behind the truck. For several seconds, I just sat there staring at that massive wall of metal completely blocking the road. In that moment, I realized there was no space to pass around it. The road was too narrow, and the shoulder was covered with frozen dirt and rocks. I quickly looked in the rearview mirror, considering reversing and heading back the way I had come. The silence of the road felt even heavier now, broken only by the sound of my car's engine idling. That was when the door of the truck's cab began to open. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I immediately shifted into reverse and started backing up down the road, trying to keep the car straight while reversing as fast as I could in the direction I had come from. After a few yards, I managed to turn into a small farm entrance I had passed earlier. I made a quick U-turn and returned to the main road as fast as I could. When I finally reached the interstate again, I kept driving for several miles before looking in the rearview mirror. I never saw that truck again. Story 5. I was driving alone on a highway in the interior of Alabama when this happened. It was a long trip that I made a few times a year to visit my parents, who lived in a small town near Selma. Normally, I tried to make the drive during the day, but that week I had left work too late and only managed to get on the road around 10 at night. Driving at night in that part of the state is very different from driving near larger cities. There are long stretches of highway where there is practically no lighting at all, just fields, trees, and small rural roads leading to places you can barely see in the dark. That night the road was especially empty. For several miles I didn't see another car, neither coming in the opposite direction nor behind me. After almost 2 hours of driving without stopping, I started noticing that the car's fuel level was getting lower than I liked. The gauge wasn't in the red yet, but it was getting close to a quarter of a tank. I knew there were a few gas stations along that highway, but many of them close early during the week. Then a few minutes after crossing a small bridge over a narrow river, I saw a cluster of lights appearing to the right side of the road. It looked like a small gas station, one of those isolated roadside places with a simple store attached to the pumps. The lights were on and illuminated the entire concrete area around the fuel pumps. That gave me a sense of relief because I really wanted to stop, stretch my legs, and fill up before continuing the trip. I slowed down and pulled into the station's parking lot. The place looked old but well lit. The lamps attached to the canopy above the pumps were all on, casting that strong white light over the concrete. The store building stood right behind them with large glass windows facing the lot. Outside there was an ice machine and some stacked boxes near the wall. At first glance everything seemed normal. Still, one thing caught my attention as soon as I stopped the car near one of the pumps. There was no one visible inside the store. Usually you can see the employee behind the counter, or at least someone moving between the shelves. Here it looked completely empty. I turned off the engine and stepped out of the car. The early morning air was warm and humid, typical of Alabama during that time of year. As I walked toward the fuel pump, I glanced again toward the store, hoping someone would appear inside. The lights were on, but the interior seemed far too still. No movement, no shadows passing across the windows. Even so, I thought the employee might be in the back room or in the restroom. I started filling the tank and stood there holding the pump while the fuel flowed. That was when I realized I wasn't the only car in the lot. On the other side of the lot, there was a car parked near the edge of the property, almost outside the area illuminated by the pump lights. At first, I hadn't noticed it because it was farther away, partially in the shadows. It was a dark sedan, the kind of model you see often on highways across the southern United States. The car's lights were off, but I could clearly see that 2 people were sitting inside. Both of them were facing in my direction. Even from a distance, it was obvious they were watching exactly what I was doing. At first, I tried not to think too much about it. It was possible they were just 2 people who had also stopped there to rest or decide whether to get gas. Still, something about the way they were sitting inside the car made me uneasy. Their engine didn't seem to be running, and neither of them was using a phone or talking. They simply sat there staring toward the fuel pumps. While my tank continued filling, I tried to act normal, but I began paying closer attention to what was happening around me. As I stood there holding the pump, I tried not to stare directly at the car across the lot for too long, but it was hard to ignore the feeling that I was being watched. The bright white light above the pumps fully illuminated the area where I was standing, while their car remained almost completely in shadow. From time to time, I could see the reflection of the light on the sedan's windshield, but I couldn't clearly make out the faces of the 2 people inside. Even so, the way they sat, perfectly still and facing exactly in my direction, made me increasingly uncomfortable. The sound of the pump filling the tank seemed much louder than usual in that late-night silence. Then something changed. The driver's door of that car slowly opened. One of the men stepped out and stood beside the vehicle for a moment. He didn't say anything and didn't gesture. He simply closed the door and began walking slowly across the lot toward me. The other man remained inside the car. I was still holding the pump, but now my full attention was on the man crossing the illuminated concrete in slow steps. He didn't seem hurried, and he didn't look like he was heading to the pumps to buy fuel. As he walked toward me, I started noticing every detail of what was happening around me. The man showed no sense of urgency. He crossed the lot calmly, looking directly at me and at my car beside the pump. The white light from the lamps reflected off the front of the jacket he was wearing, but his face remained hard to distinguish because of the shadow cast by what looked like a baseball cap. The other man was still sitting inside the car, completely motionless. Occasionally, I could see a faint reflection of his face when the pump lights bounced off the windshield. My car's tank finally finished filling and the pump made that automatic click indicating it was full. I quickly shut it off, placed the nozzle back in the holder, and closed the fuel cap. The man walking toward me was now much closer, maybe about 15 meters away. I could hear his footsteps echoing faintly on the concrete. My instincts told me immediately that I should get back into the car. I walked to the driver's door trying to appear casual, as if I were simply finishing up and leaving. I opened the door and got inside quickly, pulling it shut behind me. The man was still walking toward me, now very close to the pumps. As I inserted the key into the ignition, I had the impression that he was picking up his pace slightly. It wasn't a run, but it was no longer that slow walk from before. I turned the key and the engine started immediately. The sound of the car breaking the silence of the lot seemed extremely loud at that moment. Before driving away, I glanced quickly toward the station store. That was when I noticed something that made me even more uneasy. The lights inside the store were on exactly as they had been when I arrived, but now I could clearly see that the entrance door was locked. There was a chain wrapped around the handle of the glass door, visible in the interior light. That didn't make sense. If the station had truly been open, the door wouldn't have been secured like that. At that moment, I realized something that sent a cold feeling straight to my stomach. The station wasn't actually operating. I kept the engine running for a few seconds while looking again toward the store. The lights inside the building were still on, illuminating the empty shelves and the counter. But now that I was paying closer attention, I could see other signs that the place wasn't really functioning. Some shelves were partially empty, and there were boxes stacked near the wall as if someone had begun dismantling the interior. Even so, all the lights were on exactly like a gas station opened during the night. It looked deliberate, as if someone had left everything illuminated on purpose to make the place appear open. When I looked forward again through the windshield, the man who had left the car was much closer than I expected. He was now crossing the space between the pumps and my car in quick steps, no longer walking slowly like before. The other man was still sitting inside the sedan parked on the other side of the lot. Even from a distance, I could clearly see that he was still looking in my direction. That was enough to make me decide immediately. I put the car into gear and pulled away from the pump. As the car began moving, the man walking toward me slowed for a moment, as if realizing that I was leaving. I turned the steering wheel and drove straight toward the exit of the lot that led back to the highway. As I passed the front of the station, I glanced quickly in the side mirror. The man had stopped near the pumps and was watching my car drive away. The other man was still inside the sedan parked in the shadows. As soon as I merged back onto the highway, I accelerated until I reached the normal speed of the road. Only after several miles did I begin to slow down slightly. The highway was still as empty as before, with only my headlights illuminating the dark asphalt ahead. Even so, for several minutes I kept checking the rearview mirror, expecting to see a car leave that station and enter the road behind me. No headlights ever appeared, but to this day I still think about that place whenever I drive along isolated highways in the middle of the night, because those lights being on, the store apparently open, and that car waiting in the corner of the lot felt far less like a coincidence, and much more like a trap set for whoever stopped there alone. Story 6. I was driving alone through the interior of Texas that night, heading back after a temporary job I had taken in a small town near Abilene. At the time, I accepted that kind of work whenever it appeared because it paid well enough to make the trip worthwhile, even when I had to hit the road at inconvenient hours. That day had been long. I had spent hours unloading equipment, organizing materials, and handling last-minute details before I could finally leave. When I got into the car, it was already past 11:30 at night. The plan was to drive for a few hours and at least reach a larger town before sunrise. Anyone who has crossed Texas on secondary roads or less busy highways knows what those stretches are like during the early hours of the morning. You can spend a long time seeing nothing but the white lane lines on the asphalt, a few fences in the darkness, and occasionally distant lights from farms or isolated gas stations. That night the air was dry and a little cold, the kind that feels normal when you step outside the car but becomes more noticeable inside the cabin if you keep the windows slightly open to stay awake. I already knew that road fatigue. That feeling where your body wants to shut down but your mind keeps forcing itself to stay alert. Because of that, as soon as I entered the highway, I turned on the car radio. I always do that on solo late-night drives. Not necessarily to listen to any particular music, but to have some voice, some sound, filling the silence of the road. For the first 40 minutes, the trip was completely normal. The road stretched long and dark, with that kind of asphalt that always looks the same under the headlights, and the radio alternated between old country songs, local advertisements for stores that were probably closed hours ago, and recorded talk programs that aired during the night. I kept one hand on the steering wheel and the other resting near the gear shift, trying to stay awake by paying attention to mile markers, farm exits, and any detail that broke the repetition of the road. Traffic was almost non-existent. During that entire time, I think I passed 2 trucks going the opposite direction, and at one point saw a car very far behind me, but it eventually turned onto another road. Aside from that, it felt like I was alone in that part of the state. The dashboard cast that dim greenish light typical of older cars, illuminating my hands and the cup holder where there was a cup of coffee that had already gone almost cold. The radio was practically the only thing making the drive less monotonous. At that point, I was still relatively fine, just a little tired, but I knew that if I went too long without any stimulation, sleep would come quickly. So I kept turning through the stations, searching for any signal that covered that rural area without too much static. That was how everything started. After some time switching between stations, I found a frequency that seemed to have a clearer signal. It wasn't music. It sounded like some kind of local radio program or maybe a recorded broadcast. A man's voice was speaking slowly, almost monotonously, like someone reading a text or making some sort of announcement. At first, I didn't pay much attention to what he was saying. I was more interested in the fact that there was finally a clear voice on the radio, without the constant static of the other stations. I kept driving while the voice talked about regional roads and small nearby towns. It was the type of content local stations usually broadcast during the early hours of the morning, so nothing seemed strange. It was only a few minutes later that I started paying closer attention to what he was saying. At one point, the voice mentioned a car traveling alone on that highway during the night. That immediately caught my attention. It wasn't impossible that he was speaking in a general way about night drivers, so at first I didn't think much of it. But then he mentioned the color of the vehicle. He said something like, a dark sedan crossing the stretch between Abilene and the smaller towns to the south. I felt a small discomfort when I heard that, but I still tried to rationalize it. A lot of people drive dark cars on that highway. It could have been coincidence. A few seconds later, the voice added another detail. It mentioned part of the license plate. Not the entire plate, just a few numbers and letters that sounded far too familiar to me. That made my hand immediately move to the radio knob. I glanced at the dashboard for a second, trying to understand if I had misheard. The man on the broadcast kept speaking in the same calm tone, describing the car as if he were observing it at that moment. I quickly turned the dial to change stations. At that moment, my first thought was that I might have tuned into some strange program, or even an amateur radio transmission. The new frequency came in with a little static at first, then an old country song started playing. That gave me a small sense of relief, as if I had simply switched stations and left that strange situation behind. I continued driving for a few seconds, trying to ignore what I had heard before. But it didn't take even half a minute for something else to happen. The music suddenly disappeared as if someone had cut the transmission. The same male voice returned to the radio. The tone was exactly the same as before, slow and controlled. He began speaking again about the car on the road. This time he mentioned that the driver seemed to be alone and had been driving for quite a while. My stomach tightened immediately. I knew that wasn't coincidence. I turned the radio dial again, trying to find any other station. I passed through several frequencies quickly. Some were only static. Others had faint music that was barely audible. But whenever I stopped on a frequency with a clear signal, the same voice returned after a few seconds. It was as if it were moving across all the stations at the same time. At one moment, he mentioned the color of the car again. At another, he described the rural road where I was driving. I started looking outside with much more attention, observing the shoulder, the dark fields, and the fences that occasionally appeared in the headlights. The road remained completely empty. There was no car behind me, no vehicle coming from the opposite direction. Even so, that voice kept describing details that felt far too specific to be coincidence. After a few more minutes unsuccessfully trying to switch stations, I simply turned the radio off completely. The silence inside the car returned immediately, broken only by the constant sound of the engine and the faint whistle of the wind along the sides of the vehicle. For a few seconds I stared at the road ahead, trying to convince myself that there had to be a simple explanation. Maybe some local radio interference. Maybe some transmission that was bleeding into multiple frequencies at once. Still, the way that voice seemed to know specific details about my car kept replaying in my head. I tried to focus only on driving, keeping my eyes on the white line of the road and the small reflective signs appearing along the shoulder. That was when I started noticing something different ahead on the road. The stretch in front of me curved gently to the right, wrapping around a small rise in the terrain. The curve was visible from a distance because the reflectors mounted on low posts beside the road formed a curved line shining in the darkness. As I approached, I noticed a small dark shape on the shoulder just before the curve. At first, it looked like a stationary object, maybe an abandoned car or some piece of farm equipment left near the road. But as my headlights illuminated the area more clearly, I realized there was actually a car parked there. As I got closer to the curve, my headlights fully illuminated the vehicle on the shoulder. It was an older car, parked at an angle near the edge of the road with half the wheels already off the asphalt. The paint looked faded and covered in road dust. What really caught my attention was the large antenna mounted on the roof of the car. It wasn't a normal car radio antenna. It was tall and thick, the kind you usually see on communication equipment or amateur radio setups used for long-range transmissions. The antenna extended well above the roof of the vehicle and looked like it had been attached with improvised metal brackets. My foot came off the accelerator without me realizing it. The voice on the radio had stopped when I turned the device off, but at that moment the memory of its words came back strongly. The description of the car, the road, the fact that I was alone, and now that vehicle parked exactly at the point where the highway made a mandatory curve that forced me to pass very close to it. As my car moved slowly forward, I noticed something else. The engine of that vehicle seemed to be running. I couldn't hear it clearly yet, but the slight vibration of the body suggested there was someone inside. I gripped the steering wheel tighter as I approached the curve. My first instinct was simply to accelerate and pass without looking to the side. But as my headlights illuminated the interior of the parked car, I saw something that made my stomach tighten again. Someone was sitting in the driver's seat. The person was leaning slightly forward with their head turned toward the road, exactly as if they were watching the cars that passed by. I couldn't see the face clearly, only the silhouette, but enough to realize that whoever it was had been sitting there waiting. I didn't slow down any further. Instead, I accelerated slightly as I went through the curve and kept my eyes fixed completely on the road ahead. The car with the antenna disappeared quickly in the rearview mirror once I had passed the curve. For several minutes afterward, I kept driving without turning the radio back on, occasionally glancing at the mirror expecting to see headlights appear behind me. They never did. But even today, whenever I drive along long roads during the early hours of the morning, I remember that voice on the radio describing exactly the car I was driving, just minutes before I encountered that vehicle with the antenna parked on the shoulder.
Thank you very much for your company until the end. Your support is what gives life to this channel. If these stories have caught you, don't forget to leave your like and comment on your opinion. And if you are not yet part of our community, sign up now to receive the next real horror stories.